Coming up, the horror of child soldiers.
If we're not reacting on a moral side, then maybe we got to start reacting on the security side. Because child soldiers is a security problem.
Retired Canadian Army Lieutenant General Roméo Dallaire discusses his initiative to stop the military use of children. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Good evening. I'm Jim Traub, and welcome to Ethics Matter. Our guest this evening is General Roméo Dallaire. General Dallaire is renowned as the UN force commander in Rwanda in 1994, who desperately urged the UN and its member states to intervene to stop the genocide there, and, when that failed, did whatever he could himself with a tiny contingent of peacekeepers, saving thousands of lives from the genocide that ultimately took 800,000 lives. His book about that searing moment, Shake Hands with the Devil, was also made into a very well-known documentary of the same name. General Dallaire has drawn on his experience to create the Roméo Dallaire Child Soldiers Initiative, which seeks to train police and soldiers to prevent the use and recruitment of child soldiers and to advocate on behalf of the issue. General Dallaire, thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thank you. Very kind.
So I wanted to ask you first, it's now the 20th anniversary of the genocide, and I'm wondering, from what you know about how the world has or hasn't changed, if this happened again today, what's your sense of how, if at all, the world's response would be different from what it was then?
I fear that I'm not convinced that the world response would be different, particularly when we're looking at sub-Saharan Africa. I think what, however, is worse about today is that when we stumbled into this new era after the Cold War and all these failing states and imploding nations and civil wars, we were on a very steep learning curve in the different disciplines, be it diplomatic, political, military, security, and so on. And we were trying to figure out what to do. And so we have been nearly 25 years doing lessons learned in all these conflicts. Yet we still see a fear of using responsibility to protect, which was one of the great innovations of our time, which has made now sovereignty no more an absolute, which I think is extraordinary. But applying it is another story. So now we've had all the experience, we've seen it all, yet we don't seem to be able to get ahead of the game. We're still reacting to conflicts. We're still trying to pick up the pieces, or we're trying to throw some cash at it afterwards. And so I think it's worse now because we do have tools, but we just don't have the political elites, the sort of statesmanship to want to apply it.
So if you think about the institutions that failed to act then, which is the UN Security Council and the major member states, would you say that any of them in your mind have really internalized that failure in a way that would make them different, whether it's the UN or the US or other major Western powers, or is your sense that they haven't? It sounds from your answer like maybe you think they haven't.
There's been gestures. I mean, there's been reforms, like the Brahimi reform, but nowhere near enough in the late 90s. There's been the introduction of the optional protocol on child rights, which makes it a crime against humanity to recruit child soldiers, which became a primary weapon system in the 90s and still is today. The U.S. has Samantha Power in particular, when she was there, the security advisor brought in the Mass Atrocities Advisory Board to prepare a multidisciplinary, whole of government sort of construct on how to handle these crises, and hopefully the desire to handle them. And Kofi Annan did bring in of which I was a member, the Genocide Prevention Advisory Board and Genocide Prevention Undersecretary, linked in with R2P, and they've been working at trying to prevent this from happening. But that level is still nowhere near the political capital that politicians are prepared to invest.
I wonder if the UN is just not capable of acting preventively, because in order to act preventively, you have to act before there's a crisis. In order to act before there's a crisis, you have to be able to say to people, invest resources now even though people aren't slaughtering each other. And the Secretariat has an enormous amount of difficulty getting the member states to act in a timely way before it's exploded all over CNN.
That brings you to an interesting point, is how much does really the Security Council grasp of the scenarios out there? I mean, what assets does it really have in order to be able to go into the bringing together of the information, the analysis of it, the dissemination of the intelligence information, to give them a sense of to what extent it's happening? One of the reasons why you created the Genocide Prevention Office and R2P office was to garner all the different agencies and departments who have massive amounts of information, but they're not feeding it to each other. So even within the Secretariat, they're not pulling all that data together. But the Security Council has no strategic planning, has no strategic command and control, has no strategic sort of options into the future. It's got itself, and it turns to the Secretariat, and that depends on what the Secretary General is willing to do. Some isolate the Secretariat from the Security Council, others are more willing. So I think that, first of all, the Security Council does not have the tools. And the reforms that Kofi Annan was trying to bring in got shot down, and so nobody's picked up the ball on that. The second thing is that many of those countries don't necessarily see that it's in their personal self-interest. And as long as humanity continues to be dominated by self-interest, well, you're going to keep this whole exercise of all humans not necessarily being on the same playing field ongoing. It is, in my opinion, in our self-interest that children are not recruited in countries like Central African Republic, that you create catastrophic failures, because that means there's going to be a longevity to the conflict, and that means there's going to be massive movement of people, pandemics, extremism that can turn into terrorism, availability of resources that are going to be limited because it's a conflict zone, and God knows the impact that it may have on the diasporas in our own country. So all those conflicts have an interest in us, but we don't seem to be able to grasp it.
Yeah, we repeat the idea that it is in our interest and not just a moral proposition, but the fact is states don't really feel that. They feel like it may be the right thing to do, but it's not a matter of national interest.
And it's absolutely wonderful you raised this point about the moral reference, because, I mean, we don't like wars with using, look at what happened with chemical weapons and so on. How come we can tolerate wars where the primary weapon system are children? I mean, the children are massively used, and yet we don't seem to be wanting to engage, certainly not even in preventing, let alone trying to stop them. And what tools do we have to stop that recruitment and to divert that youth into another arena than simply going to forced recruitment, because there's no voluntarism in recruitment of child soldiers. A country that's in a state of conflict, there's no such thing as volunteering. I mean, you're doing it because you're seeking safety or whatever, but it's not because you really want to go and fight. So we're in an era where the moral reference, I mean, children, doesn't carry the weight. So that's where, when I started to look at that dimension of genocide prevention, mass atrocities, the R2P, the operational, I started to see that the child soldier side of it, which was a forerunner of many of the conflicts, like in Rwanda, why isn't there a reaction to the use of children? And so if we're not reacting on a moral side, then maybe we got to start reacting on the security side, because child soldiers is a security problem. And so it's an extension of the security scenario. And so it's got to be raised to that level, and then reaction should be according to that level of insecurity. And only when you do bring security back will those child soldiers not be required, of course.
Well, let me ask you about the transition in your own life from this searing period in Rwanda until you created the Child Soldiers Initiative. Because you've been very open about the immense trauma that you went through, including thoughts of suicide and so forth.
Attempts.
Attempts, that's much stronger than thoughts. And it really strikes me in reading about your story that the people who have a conscience wind up suffering in a way that the people who may have been the cause of this so much suffering, but don't have the conscience, they actually wind up not suffering. Whereas you, who actually were one of the great heroes of this story, wound up suffering enormously for it. And I'm sure that irony must have struck you at times.
I get a certain solace of that by the fact that we've introduced instruments to try to fight impunity. And so that people simply won't be able to walk away from it as they have. I think the introduction through the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court to operationalize it, to give it more legs, is an important factor in making people realize that you can be held accountable sooner or later for the actions you take. But in regards to us who have been into it, Rwanda was a genocide, it was a civil war, but the killing was done, and maiming was done by youths, a militia. Young wing of a political party that was slowly converted into a militia and indoctrinated into hate, and they're the ones who did it.
Let's talk in more detail about the Child Soldier Initiative that you've created. So maybe just first you can just explain what the scope of the initiative is that you've authored.
What we've garnered by being an intellectually rigorous body, because it's based at the Dalhousie University. Dr. Whitman, who's here, is our executive director. It's a research-based training and advocacy body that is working at, ultimately the mission is to eradicate the use of children as weapons of war. Eradicate means getting it out of the minds of adults that they actually can turn to kids to do this. And in so doing, the application of it is by preventing the recruitment and introducing methodologies in that, including even in school programs. And when they are so recruited, is preparing military and police for security forces to be able to handle these child soldiers without letting it escalate to force on force, or without simply treating them as combatants and destroying them, as we're still seeing. And so discovering that no military in the world, except the Marine Corps, I'm a graduate from the U.S. Marine Corps Staff College, and they had in their doctrine, avoid confrontation. That was the only thing they had. Well, that gets a little difficult at times, although it may not be a bad idea if the only solution is to start destroying them. So we build these training capabilities of both contingents and national capabilities of nations in order for them to comprehend that children, young people, can be prevented from being recruited and also can be neutralized as a weapon system without necessarily the use of force.
So let's talk separately about these two very difficult parts, the prevention part and then what you do when you're confronted with child soldiers. Because you said in the end, prevention means persuading the insurgents and others, or national armies, who would be using child soldiers that they couldn't. I have to say that seems implausible to me. That is, given what a cheap and expendable resource children are from the point of view of the people who are going to be doing this, how do you persuade them that it's not in their interest to basically take some 10-year-old and give them a gun?
And the demographics would go along with that too, of how many of those countries have such large portions of population under 15, let alone under 18. And one of the things that we do, we're now, in fact, building a national capability in Sierra Leone. The President of Sierra Leone has mandated us, and we're looking at, and we've been training trainers now, who in fact have been communicating with us through the Ebola scenario of what's been going on. And we've participated with the British to train the contingent going into Somalia. And we're into the exercise with them of the attempts at bringing the child soldier dimension of training to the military and police to an extent where we can convince them that they're a disadvantage to an advantage. And so you walk them through.
So what are the negatives? We can understand the positives, alas, all too well. What are the negatives that you try to persuade them of?
Well, they only can carry so much ammunition and weapons. The training has got to be very focused and very limited, so your maneuver capabilities are extremely limited. They are prone to sickness and disease, so you lose a lot your rotation. They're also very truthful, so if they ever get caught, the whole beans will be spilled. And they are working often, essentially under duress all the time. So unless you've got an ability to really maintain control of them, you're going to be in continuous rebuilding your forces because they're escaping the minute the shooting starts and so on. You're going to be wasting a lot of assets because they're not very skilled at the use of force. And so you start going down this panoply of points, and then you say, well, what was your aim? What do you want to achieve with this conflict? And they start to realize that maybe they're not going to achieve it because the scale or the capabilities of their force simply won't achieve that.
So, but let's talk about the other side of this, the question of what you are training the security personnel to do in the situation where they're confronted by a child holding a gun facing them. So, because I would think they might say to you, these kids are nuts. They're too young to have a conscience yet, and so I can't afford to do things that might spare their lives. I've just got to shoot first and ask questions later. So what do you tell them that they can do and should do?
One of the interesting things is that they don't shoot first.
Yeah.
Is that when they're facing a child, they back off. And in the training we've been doing, we've been seeing more peacekeepers saying, well, they're kids and we're not too sure how they're going to react, so we'll back off and we'll send in maybe some child protection people we'll see how we can maybe get around the problem. And giving ground to and giving credence to those who are
Which,
using
of course,
it.
makes them a tremendously effective platform.
Absolutely. And the other thing is that there's a spectrum of things you can do before you actually end up with a force-on-force, gun-to-gun scenario in the different situations, because it's not that often that you actually have the outright fighting. It's the maneuvering, it's the checkpoints, it's how to prevent them from being able to be used effectively. And in so doing, we're discovering that the forces are just not wanting to look at those options, except finding themselves in either catastrophic scenarios of force-on-force, and we're not negating that there may be circumstances where, yeah, you may end up killing children in extremis. But that doesn't necessarily be the doctrine. And we believe that you can build a doctrine from which you get your training, your tactics, your equipment, including non-lethal weapons if necessary, organizations to face child soldiers. And so we are very convinced, and so as we see them, is that there are ways of de-escalating scenarios in order to not give ground, but also not necessarily destroy the children. One of the angles that we're hoping to get funding, because we're always on the scrounge, of course, is women in the forces, police and military, being more in the front lines in conflicts where child soldiers are there. For the children are linking much easier to the presence of women than they are to men, and particularly the girls, because up to 40% of child soldiers are girls.
When you imagine child soldiers, you think boy. So it's striking for you to say actually 40% of them are women.
Because the child soldier is not necessarily the AK-47 boy, 13, blowing away everybody around them. In fact, a child soldier is any youth engaged or caught up into a force that is employing them in a conflict.
They could be carrying weapons back and forth towards the front. They could be
running the bivouacs.
Yeah.
Male-dominated societies, the girls, in fact, build the bivouacs, get all the logistics, and also even being used as sex slaves and bushwives. So all that is a child soldier, and not just the one up front. And so how to get at them, not only when they're in fact used up front, but in the other arenas, is part of the training assets and the tactics we're working on.
Ian Fishback, I'm on the faculty at West Point. I've encountered children on the battlefield It's a pressing issue. Most of the things you were talking about struck me as things that might affect a tactical decision by an individual soldier, but they didn't strike me as game changers that would really change the strategic dynamic on the battlefield. And so as I think of what might tip the balance and deter otherwise immoral or at least amoral commanders from using child soldiers and recruiting them, one would be overwhelming force. You could bring a lot of force to bear, probably at relatively low cost, but you'd kill a lot of children. I think that's ethically wrong. But the other way I think you could do it is try to crack the code on what keeps the children from surrendering, because it's probably different in significant ways than what keeps adults from surrendering. Or it might not be, I don't know, but it's a question worth pursuing. I wonder if you've pursued it, if you've found anything out, what your ideas would be.
You're right that at times you might think that we're nickel and diming the tactical scenario by training these soldiers. However, in a mission area, when you look at places like, in fact, the Congo and Central African Republic, when the South Africans lost 16 guys to child soldiers, it became a massive problem. I mean, the nation backed off. And so those tactical engagements by the military working with the police, and also, interesting, we're opening the debate and discussions with the NGO world because they've got all kinds of information that's available if they trust the military. And so I've got real problems with the humanitarian space and neutrality. You know, the NGO that won't use the military but is going to hire a security company that's made up of all ex-military, and what are the rules of engagement those guys are using and so on. So I think there's some interesting ethical debates going on, but I believe that what we're doing is making people trust each other, exchange intelligence information, police, military, and some of the NGOs, and in so doing, get ahead of the game in regards to the use of force by, yes, overwhelming force in certain areas, or simply changing their tactics of how to handle it, like the use of women and the like. So the attrition of the use of children is not insignificant because you don't need hundreds of thousands of them to scare the living daylights out of adults. Particularly a 13-year-old with an AK-47 is totally unpredictable. The kid who put the AK-47 in my nostril in Rwanda at a checkpoint, and his eyeballs are that big and his finger is on the trigger, and all the other kids are around him screaming and yelling and so on, and he's sweating, you absolutely have no idea what's going to make him pull that trigger. An adult, you can give a better sense, but the kid, you could have, and what saved me, I believe, is the chocolate bar in my hand, which threw him off, and then we moved out. So the tactical dimensions is crucial. How to pull them out, how to extract them. I was in the Congo extracting some child soldiers. Use of radio stations. Radio is extraordinary. Informing them how to do that. Informing the troops how to extract them. As an example, the kids wanting to demobilize or come out, they come up to a UN force, and the guy says, well, you know, the rules say that I got to hand you over to UNICEF, and the UNICEF guy's coming in tomorrow morning, so come back tomorrow. Just simplistic things like that. The use of indirect fire can also be of significance without necessarily attacking them. But I think that your position and what we are very much engaged in is the prevention of the recruitment. And so once they're recruited, how do you pull them back out? Is by indirect means. And the radios, making forces amiable, bringing women more to the fore. They see them. Because they're all over, the kids, you know, they're doing reconnaissance and so on, and they will see that atmosphere significantly change. But most of the forces don't even know that. Most of the forces don't even recognize that the 12, 13-year-old loitering around, or the 14-year-old that's doing their laundry, may be in fact a recce for the force that's the belligerent force there, and that you don't use them. And you got to report them, Many don't even report the fact that they've seen child soldiers. Just say, we faced so-and-so.
But is that because they so take for granted the exploitation of children that way that it doesn't strike them as a shocking thing to see, so not reportable, not worthy of being reported?
Well, you know, that's interesting in that angle, but I think it's just that they're doing it as per the criteria that has been established so far, and that we haven't pushed that to the extent of recognizing the difference of use of child soldiers to adults. I mean, it took a long time for us to segregate when they were demobilizing them, the kids, well, men and women to start with, and kids from adults. So this is still an element that often they don't realize that maybe they should be reporting, and that we can collate that data and give us an opportunity of preventing future recruitment by providing security maybe to villages or areas without having to do the Gulu walks, but certainly do something of more significance than simply watch them being extracted, pulled out of their villages, and us watching it happen. You're right into the heart of it. Well done, West Point.
General Dallaire, I have to say, I find it very inspiring that a person who's seen as much horror as you retains that hopefulness and idealism. Thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.